The last train of the night always felt different. James had taken this route dozens of times before, but tonight, something was off. The usual low hum of passengers chatting, the rustling of newspapers, the occasional cough, none of it was there. The car was empty. At first he was relieved. No loud commuters. No crying babies, just a peaceful late-night ride home. But as the train rumbled forward, a suffocating stillness settled in. Something about the silence felt wrong. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. The air smelled stale, like damp metal and something faintly rotting. James pulled out his phone to check the time. 2:47 a.m. He frowned. He didn't remember it being that late. A low static crackled through the intercom. Then, a voice, but not the usual robotic conductor's announcement. This voice was distorted, stretched thin and static-laced as if spoken through a broken radio. Next stop, end of the line. James shivered. That wasn't right. His stop was still miles away. The train lurched, nearly throwing him forward. Then, a sound. From the far end of the car, soft. Deliberate. Footsteps. James turned his head slowly. A figure stood at the opposite end of the train car. A tall, impossibly thin man, dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. His hat sat at an odd angle, casting a shadow over his face or where a face should have been. Instead, there was nothing, just smooth, featureless skin. James' stomach twisted. The conductor tilted its head as if studying him. Then it took a step forward. James gripped the seat, his breath caught in his throat. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, the figure moved closer. James' pulse pounded in his ears. The train rattled through the tunnel, its rhythm uneven, too fast, then too slow, then fast again. The air grew colder. The conductor stood only a few seats away now, its head twitching at odd angles like a broken marionette. James forced himself to stand. He had to get to another car. Now. The doors at the far end of the train were locked. He had checked earlier. But maybe he had missed something. He took a shaky step back. The conductor matched his movement, one step, then another. A sickening, wet clicking sound came from beneath its skin, as if something inside it was rearranging itself. James turned and ran. His footsteps thundered against the metal floor as he sprinted toward the doors. His fingers fumbled at the locked handle. Behind him, a whisper, so close it tickled his ear. "Tickets, please." James whipped around, but the car was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps. No, it had been right there. He had seen it. The train lights flickered again. And for a split second he saw them, not just one, but dozens. Passengers, crammed into the seats, except they weren't people. Their faces were gone, erased, just like the conductor's. Their bodies were twisted, frozen in unnatural positions. Some had arms that stretched too long. Others had necks bent at impossible angles. Their mouths moving but making no sound. And in the middle of them all, the conductor, now inches from James' face. Its voice came in a slow, rotting whisper. "You should have gotten off." The train lurched violently, throwing James backward. His head slammed against the floor. Darkness swallowed him whole. James woke to silence. His head throbbed, his vision blurred. The train had stopped. He sat up slowly, his fingers brushing against the cold metal floor. The air was heavier now, thick with a rotting stench. Something was wrong. The doors were open. Outside was nothing. No platform, no station, no city lights, just darkness. An endless void stretching far beyond what the eye could comprehend. James' chest tightened. This wasn't his stop. This wasn't any stop. A shuffling noise echoed from behind him. James turned and felt his blood turn to ice. The passengers were standing now, row after row of faceless figures, their heads slowly turning toward him in eerie synchronization. The conductor stood in front of them, its skeletal hand outstretched. James' breath came in short, panicked bursts. "Please," he choked out. "I just want to go home." The conductor's head tilted. Then, it smiled, the skin where its mouth should have been split open. peeling away like wet paper to reveal a gaping, black abyss lined with rows of needle-like teeth. And in that moment, James knew there was no way off this train. There never had been. The conductor extended its hand, voice rattling with static. "Next stop, the rest of your life," James tried to scream. But the doors slammed shut, the train surged forward, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The Midnight Express cut through the darkness, its rhythmic clatter echoing through the empty countryside. It was supposed to be a quiet ride. Natalie sank into her seat, pulling her coat tight around her. The train was nearly deserted. There was just a handful of passengers scattered through the cars. An older man reading a newspaper, a young couple whispering in hushed voices, a woman staring blankly out the window, her reflection warped by the streaks of rain. And then there was him, a man sitting at the far end of the car, dressed in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat. He hadn't moved since she got on. Hadn't spoken, hadn't even looked up, just sat there still as a statue. The train rumbled on, the dim lights flickering overhead. A voice crackled through the intercom. "Next stop, Black Hollow Station." Natalie shivered. She'd never heard of that stop before. Then heard a sharp scream, coming from the next car. The train lurched, the lights flickering wildly, then silence. Natalie's heart pounded. The other passengers looked around, wide-eyed, frozen in place. The door at the end of the car creaked open. A man stumbled through. His shirt was soaked in red. He swayed on his feet, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak. Then he collapsed. Natalie shot to her feet, a scream catching in her throat. A knife protruded from his back, buried to the hilt. Someone had murdered him. And they were still on the train. The train didn't stop. The body lay sprawled in the aisle, blood pooling beneath it. Natalie's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. The other passengers were on their feet now, eyes darting between each other. No one spoke. No one moved. Then the old man with the newspaper muttered, "We need to check the other cars." Natalie hesitated. What if the killer was still out there? But she couldn't just sit here, waiting to be next. She followed as the group crept forward, stepping over the dead man's body. The door to the next car slid open with a hiss. The first thing she noticed was the blood smeared across the windows. The second thing, the seats were empty, no passengers, no bodies. Nothing but the rhythmic sound of the train clattering against the tracks. Natalie turned to the others. "Where is everyone?" No one answered. A low chuckle echoed through the car, slow, amused. Natalie's blood ran cold. The man in the dark coat and wide-brimmed hat was standing now. For the first time, he lifted his head just enough for her to see his face. Her stomach dropped, his eyes were missing. Two gaping black holes stared back at her, and in his hand, a bloody knife. The train lights flickered violently, and in that brief moment of darkness, someone screamed. When the lights came back on, the old man was dead. His throat had been slashed open. His body twitched before going still. Natalie staggered backward, her breath sharp and ragged. The young couple bolted, sprinting toward the next car. The man in the dark coat didn't chase them. He just smiled, a slow, knowing smile. Natalie turned and ran. The train jolted violently, nearly throwing her off balance. The next car was just as empty as the last, no conductors, no passengers, no escape. A metallic clinking noise echoed behind her. Footsteps. Slow, measured. The killer was following her. Natalie reached the very last car. The emergency breaker only hope gleamed under the dim lights. She lunged for it. A hand grabbed her wrist. Ice-cold fingers dug into her skin, yanking her back. She screamed, twisting, fighting, and then the train stopped. Dead stop. The doors slid open. Natalie gasped for breath, her head snapping up. She expected station lights, a city, something. But instead, nothing. Outside was a black void, stretching endlessly in all directions. No land, no sky, just emptiness. The killer leaned in close and whispered in her ear. End of the line. He shoved her and she tumbled forward, screaming, and fell into the void. The train doors slammed shut. and the Midnight Express rumbled forward. The man didn't flinch, he didn't move, he just smiled, and the lights went out.